Hello, this is Lonnie with Rolling O Farm. Today I want to talk with you about something that I have come to believe is probably one of the most important keys to the long-term success of raising goats and sheep. It'll increase the profitability and also better the health of your herd or flock. I'm talking about rotational grazing. What is rotational grazing? Why is it so beneficial? Well, come along. So when we're talking about rotational grazing, basically all we're talking about is taking your pasture, dividing it up into multiple sections or paddocks, and rotating your animals through those paddocks, one paddock at a time, allowing the other paddocks to rest. Now obviously this is going to take a little bit more infrastructure, and it's also going to take some more effort, but I believe it's worth it. I really do believe that this is the best long-term management practice that we can put in place for the health of the animals, for the health of the pasture, and also profitability in raising goats and sheep. Here are 3 reasons why. So the first and maybe the most important benefit of rotational grazing is controlling the parasite load in your pastures. Probably the biggest challenge that goat and sheep producers, at least in the southeast United States, have is controlling parasites, particularly stomach worms. There's been so much overuse of chemical dewormers through the years that what's happened is the worms, the parasites that we now have, are resistant to most of the wormers that are on the market, or most of the dewormers that are on the market. And so trying to manage the parasite load by chemical deworming is going to be an uphill challenge for us. So we need another tool in our toolbox, and rotational grazing is that tool. What rotational grazing does is it allows enough time to break the life cycle of the parasite so that the animals are not constantly being reinfested. Now, nearly all goats and sheep have stomach worms to some degree or another, and that's normal and not necessarily harmful. But what happens is the stomach worms that they have are reproducing. They're laying thousands of eggs. And those eggs are traveling down the digestive tract and being defecated out on the pasture. So every time your goat or sheep poops, it's probably depositing thousands of worm eggs onto your pasture. Those eggs are then hatching out, and the larva is climbing up the stem of the grass. And then as your goat or sheep comes along and eats that grass, it's ingesting that larva. That larva then travels down to its stomach or intestines and attaches itself to the stomach wall and begins to suck blood. As it matures, then it begins to produce thousands of eggs, which are deposited on your pasture, which hatch out and are then reinfesting your goats and sheep more. So the longer you leave your animals on one spot of land, the more that buildup of parasites is increasing. More eggs are being laid, more larvae is being ingested, more worms are attaching themselves to the lining of the animal. Eventually, the animal is overwhelmed. It can't produce enough red blood cells to keep up with what's being sucked out of its system. So it becomes anemic, weak, and sickly. However, if the larva that is hatched out on your pasture is not ingested by the goat or sheep, it's soon going to die. The whole process from the worm egg hatching out in the pasture, climbing up the grass as a larva, and remaining on the grass until the time it dies on its own is about 3 weeks. So if we can move our animals off of the worm-infested paddock before those eggs hatch out and are re-ingested by the animals, and then we can leave that paddock dormant or without any animals on it for a long enough period of time for those larvae to die off before we bring the animals back to that, then what we're doing is we're breaking the life cycle of the parasite, we're greatly reducing the parasite load, and we're doing all of that without chemical dewormers. So the first benefit to rotational grazing is we are grazing animals only for a short period of time on a particular spot of land, and we're moving them off of that spot of land before the worm eggs that they're depositing have time to hatch out, form larvae, and be ingested. and then we're leaving them off of that piece of land long enough for that larva to die out before bringing the animals back on. Now that period of time, how long we rest that land, we'll talk about that in an upcoming video, in the next video in this series on rotational grazing. But the basic concept is we're wanting to move the animals off of the land before they can be reinfested by the worms that they're depositing there, therefore breaking the worm life cycle. So the second benefit of rotational grazing is actually the health of your pasture and the diversity of forage for your animals to eat. What you're doing is you're really creating a cycle where the animals come in, they mow, and they fertilize. And then you move them and give that paddock time to fully recover and regrow before the animals are reintroduced. And what you're doing is you're preserving the better plants, the better grasses and plants in your pasture. If you just leave your goats and sheep on the same paddock month after month, year after year, what they'll do is they'll overgraze all of the highly desirable plants and eventually kill them out, and all you'll be left with are the weeds and the less nutritional plants in the paddock. But if you move them out after a short period of time of grazing, you don't allow them to overgraze it to the point where they're killing out those desirable plants, and you're allowing those desirable plants to regrow stronger and healthier, and then you're bringing the animals back in again. So this works well for keeping the desirable plants alive in your paddock. It also creates a diversity of diet for your animals because they're not killing off some of the plants that they prefer. And so you're able to maintain the health of your pasture over the years in a much more efficient way. Which can lead to a third benefit of rotational grazing, and that is higher stocking rates. If you have a limited amount of land and you're trying to maximize the number of animals that you can run on that land, rotational grazing is absolutely necessary. Because what's happening is as you're allowing that pasture to rest and regrow the forage that's there, it's growing in thicker and healthier, and you're able to maintain it longer, which means it has more nutrition and you're able to hold more animals on that. In my area in northwest Alabama, if you have good grass, you can comfortably do continuous grazing with about 3 head per acre. However, with intensive rotational grazing, I've been able to run as many as 7 per acre. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that. Normally what I say is if you're doing rotational grazing with really good forage, you can hold up to about 5 goats or sheep per acre in my area. Now, every region is going to be different depending on how productive your soil is and your growing season and all of those things. But rotational grazing allows you to maximize the number of animals that you can have on your property because you're keeping your forage healthier, you're keeping your pasture healthier, you're giving it time to recover, and therefore those animals are able to get more nutrition out of the same amount of land. So an additional benefit of rotational grazing is the general health of your herd or flock. If animals are forced to stay in the same area for a long period of time, what happens is they tend to defecate in the same area, they tend to graze in the same area, and over time there becomes a buildup of manure and mud and muck, and that's just the perfect breeding ground for all types of bacteria and diseases. So rotational grazing causes them to only be in an area for a short period of time. There's not time for them to have that buildup of manure and muck. And then they're moved to a clean area where there is none of that. And that first area is allowed to rest long enough that whatever bacteria may be there is likely to die out before the animals are brought back into that same area. Now, this is particularly beneficial with a few problems that goats and sheep are susceptible to. Foot problems, such as foot scald or hoof rot, are caused by a bacteria that is in the soil that is particularly prevalent in wet conditions where animals have been standing a lot, and they've been doing that for a long period of time. If you're having problems with foot scald or hoof rot, rotational grazing will be a great tool in your arsenal for beating that. Because what you're doing is, let's say your animals are having problems with that, but the bacteria that causes that is in the soil in this particular paddock. So before you move them to the next paddock, you treat them, move them to the next paddock, leave that first paddock long enough for that bacteria to die out, and then move the animals back around, and you break the cycle of that bacteria. So just like with breaking the life cycle of a parasite by rotational grazing, you break the life cycle of a bacteria the same way. So unless your stocking rate is only 1 goat or sheep per acre, rotational grazing is probably something that would be beneficial for you and worth looking into. It'll increase the health of your herd, it'll increase the health of your pasture, and it'll also probably help your bank account as well. Now, it does require some extra planning and effort, and we're going to talk about that in the next video in this series. If you found this video to be helpful, I'd appreciate it if you would like it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for goats or sheep and you're within driving distance of Northwest Alabama, whether you're looking for a starter herd or flock or maybe some additional breeding stock, give me a call, see what I have available. I appreciate you watching the video. As always, happy farming.